One thing that the French are really good at, being Islamophobic. If you think American Islamophobia is bad, just wait until you see French Islamophobia. This is a new level of Islamophobia unlocked. This topic is of interest to me for 3 reasons. Number 1, I am Senegalese. I lived in France, I lived in the United States, and my name is Aisha, so you can make your own conclusions. In general, American racism and French racism operate very differently. They are 2 separate countries with 2 different histories after all. But I would argue that when it comes to Islamophobia, the French definitely have us beat. Aisha, why are you talking about this? This video was inspired by a conversation that I had with 5 French guys at a bar. You guys know who you are. Ça va? Where they were talking about the loss of French culture in France and the way that immigrants come and impose their culture onto French people. And of course, one of the examples that they gave was of mostly Muslim immigrants who come to France and do things like wear the hijab, which they view as an imposition. There are a couple different things that make Islamophobia in France different than Islamophobia in the United States. The historical context of France, the relationship between the French people and religion, number 1, the idea of laïcité, number 2, the legacy of French colonization, number 3. It's just a bunch of different things, and it's really an interesting subject. It's an interesting topic. To use a personal anecdote to illustrate my point, and this is not to generalize and say that all French people are Islamophobic. I'm not saying that. I'm saying that France has an Islamophobia problem. That's clear to anyone who has eyes. Anyway, to use a personal anecdote, when I was living in France, I was living with a host family, and I remember that they told me that they would not accept a student to stay in their home if that student was veiled, if that student was wearing the hijab. And I remember that the host dad was saying that he doesn't want that kind of influence on his children. He had a daughter and he didn't want that kind of influence on his daughter. And I think with Islamophobia in France, it's interesting because there is the religious aspect and there is the racial aspect. It's very similar to the way that anti-Semitism functions in that way, because there's an overlap, obviously, between people who are Arab and people who are Muslim, but not all people who are Arab are Muslim, but France has a problem with them both. Because of immigration, because of changing socioeconomic dynamics in France, because they didn't have enough people to work in France, which is why they wanted people to immigrate there in the first place. And it's funny because when I was talking to these guys, they were talking about the immigration problem in France, right? The immigration question. And they were saying that, immigrants come, France is going broke and they come and they use the social services and basically they don't contribute. And I was saying, well, don't you think that's a problem of your own making? Do you feel like it's a coincidence that the countries that immigrants come from when they come to France are countries that France has colonized? There's also another factor here which I think is interesting, which is that, again, this is a generalization. We're talking about a level of culture here. There has to be a level of generalization. Anyway, I need to stop shadow boxing with people in comments. Anyway, there's also a level of difference in American and French racism in general, including Islamophobia, because of the different ways that American and French people act and speak. In a lot of ways, French people are more direct than Americans. In the United States, say that you're at work and somebody gives you something that sucks, like they return a project that is really bad. It is very unlikely that somebody's gonna say to your face just directly, "This is horrible. Why did you give this to me?" It would be viewed as extremely rude, right? Whereas in France, it is more common to say, this is what were you even thinking? This is awful, you know what I mean? Whereas Americans, and that's why French people think that Americans are fake, because Americans will soften and kind of be like, use the language of, constructive criticism and be like, I think there's areas for improvement here or something like that, In general, one of the reasons that French people think Americans are fake is because Americans are like, oh my God, this is so exciting. And again, generalizations, but it's common in American culture to say that this is awesome. This is so amazing. I am so happy for you. Big smile, lots of laughs. French people are not on that wavelength. Anyway, all that to say that the French people are more direct with their racism too. I've had much more racist experiences in France than I have in the United States. At the same time, you have to remember that where you live, both in France and in the United States, will affect your experience. I have been kind of all over France. Like, I've been to Paris, I've been to Lyon, I've been to Strasbourg, I've been to Les Pays Basques. Anyway, I digress. I was just saying that, this is only one perspective, so take it with a grain of salt. Also, and I always say this, and I joke with my French friends about this, is that France is 15 years behind the United States. I mean, they're literally just getting 5G, guys. Hey, you can't be mad at me when it's true. They're literally just getting 5G. But also, sometimes I feel like socio-culturally as well. Like, France is influenced by, like, American protest movements, like, for example, like Black Lives Matter and things of that nature. But sometimes it happens later than it is happening in the United States. Almost like France is a little on the periphery, and the French people are going to complain and say that, like, I'm just centering the United States. But it's just true that the United States has influenced a lot of French culture. Look at French rap, for example. Anyway, all that to say that things that perhaps were normalized to say in the United States, like 20 years ago, are normal to say in France right now. Like, the kinds of microaggressions, in France, they're not microaggressions, they're macroaggressions, and they don't think that you should be offended. I remember there was an exterminator who asked if there were Africans who were living upstairs because there were cockroaches in the apartment downstairs. And he was like, oh, those Africans, they eat on the floor. So that might be your cockroach problem. Cultural differences aside, you can't talk about Islamophobia in France without talking about terrorism and the impacts of, like, attacks like the Charlie Hebdo and situations like that. Something that France and the United States actually have in common is that they both destabilize countries, which foments religious extremism, and then they blame the people for the religious extremism instead of investigating the causes. Imperialism. It's funny, when I said this to these guys, they were like, oh, so everything is always our fault, huh? And it's like, well, yes, actually. Another cultural difference, and I always say this, is that in the United States, even like certain conservative type white people are afraid of being called racists. Like, it is a concern where people will, like, hedge and they'll say, like, and they'll be like, oh, but I don't mean, and da da da, because they don't want to be accused of being racist. French people do not care about being accused of being racist at all. Again, overgeneralization, but there just is not that sensibility of being like, oh, but I didn't mean da 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 da. No, like, they will literally say the most racist thing straight to your face, and they'll be like, and what about it? Bah, bah. Non, mais qu'on arrête. At least one thing that I can give the French is that they're equal opportunity haters, because in their defense, they are condescending like that towards many groups. For example, Americans. But the Islamophobia, yeah. The Islamophobia is a real problem.